I am Jason Graves. Never trust anyone who needs a haircut. And Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is the game that doesn't try. It's like an own goal, or when NBA teams lose on purpose. It's bad, but it's bad intentionally, so why should I care? It's not necessarily incompetent, it isn't even lazy. This is a game with no ambition. Mystic Quest isn't bad because they failed, it's bad by design. The surrounding philosophy was flawed. You're probably aware, but in the off chance you're not, Square was disappointed by the sales of Final Fantasy IV outside of Japan. So instead of releasing 5, they custom made a game just for the American market. A dumbed down rendition of the turn-based game, or an entry-level RPG as the marketing materials would put it. It's a kid's game, has as much in common with Elmo's Numberland or the Rugrats game as it does Final Fantasy VII.
The best cookies ever! Did Cookie Monster save one for Elmo?
No.
As Shin Megami Tensei and Dragon Quest V validated the idea that video games were growing up as an art form, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is the counterpoint, affirming that they were still toys. The medium still had a long way to go. When doing these videos, I like to play these games in a variety of ways. So far in this series, I've used a real cartridge inside a Super Nintendo, a real cartridge inside a Retron 5, SNES 9X, Hygan, a hacked Switch running RetroArch, and for this game, a modified Super Nintendo Classic. Every method has involved a real SNES controller, on PC with the help of this adapter that I bought on RetroUSB.com in around 2008. And using the wireless SNES controller for the Switch that you can order on Nintendo's website. I used a border in the CRT filter. It resulted in this oscillating line at the top of the screen. I don't know why, but there it is. Hope it doesn't drive you too crazy. The idea was to get new people into RPGs. It spanned the market, the blue ocean strategy, if you will. Today, if you wanted to do this, get somebody new into RPGs, Mystic Quest wouldn't cross my mind for a second. I'd hand them Pokemon, but since that didn't exist yet, for a time in the mid-90s, if done well, this game could have filled that niche. Square was forthcoming that this was a game intended for babies. That's fair. Since your expectations should change, I'm going to attempt to criticize from the perspective of somebody who's new to video games. Instead of asking myself if this game is worthwhile, let's ask, if you handed this to a 5-year-old, or your grandma, what might their experience be like? For one, it doesn't have a plot, it doesn't have characters, so I'm not going to complain about that. This was clearly intended as a purely mechanical exercise. They did a lot of things to streamline the genre norms. Obviously, the active time battle system was scrapped. There are no save points. And instead of the traditional ways of saving on the overworld, you can save anywhere, anytime outside of battle. There is no MP. Instead, they've reverted back to the set number of charges system, not unlike the one in the first Final Fantasy. No random encounters. Every enemy is visible on the map, avoidable if you wish. Every chest with consumables respawn, allowing you to farm them to infinity. Your party only has a maximum of 2, and they're CPU controlled by default. All upgrades to your weapons and armor equipped to the best loadout automatically. Lastly, the free-roaming overworld was replaced by a Super Mario-style level select. If you're making an introductory experience, what works and what doesn't? I'd say this style overworld does. There's nowhere to get lost, and it makes backtracking easier than it would have been otherwise. I'm also an outspoken, adamant fan of auto battle, and had my partner on that setting most of the time. It, theoretically anyway, should make battles faster. And also the AI cheats by not selecting their move at the start of the turn. They use the extra info gained as the round progresses. Say you start at full health, the enemy attacks. Well, you never would have known to heal yourself at the beginning of the round. Your computer-controlled companion does. And you can use this to your advantage. While you do gain this convenience, it's a double-edged sword. The AI isn't aggressive enough when fighting weak encounters. In a situation where the optimal play would have been to forego healing to attack and finish off the enemy, The auto battle companion will always default to the cure spell instead of the attack. The most substantial mistake Square made is that they didn't make an easy game, they made a forgiving one, an important difference. You would think, since this is essentially positioned as an educational game of sorts, that it would require the player to learn something to progress. If you die, you continue from the start of a battle without penalty. It makes the ability to save anywhere redundant, and wouldn't change the experience if they had opted into the more traditional method of set save points. If you were to remove the continue function and the save anywhere system, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest would be characterized by an average to above average difficulty. The folly in making something forgiving as opposed to easy is that it removes any and all stakes from the proceedings. Look at Pokemon. The games are always incredibly effortless to get through, assuming your brain had continued to develop past the first grade, that is. But at least you can still lose the battles. They at least keep up the appearance of some kind of a struggle. In a stroke of irony because the lack of random battles, the way they play out ends up being too random if your goal is to teach players how these games work. Take this fire boss. Not only is it plausible, it's likely that he'll move at the end of the round one turn, and first in the next. If he decides to use his AoE fuck you fire move twice in a row, which he did to me on more than one occasion, it's death every single time. There's nothing you can do. It takes you from full health to 0 without letting you take a turn. And just to add another random element, this is one of those games where you miss a lot, roughly a quarter of the time starting out. The continue system combined with the arbitrarily determined battles doesn't promote using different tactics to achieve a different outcome. It encourages you to do the same thing repeatedly until the RNG shakes out in your favor. You're not taught to go around the brick wall, you're taught to keep kicking until it falls over. I lost the tutorial battle. Not because I did anything wrong, there's only one option. It's not like Pokemon where you can use Growl or Leer or something. All you can do is attack, and I lost because my character decided to miss one too many times. Again, if the goal was to teach you how to battle in a turn-based RPG, this is lousy. Simplifying the mechanics is fine, but the random outcomes completely undercut the point. Something else that might trip up a new player. After beating a boss, the key item that is required to progress is inside of a chest you need to go over there and open, as opposed to the cutscene just giving it to you. Sure, it's obvious to me, and I'm sure you, the viewer, would never forget to open a chest. But imagine you're 5 years old, overcome by the emotion of killing a big bad skeleton monster, and you don't notice that there's a chest in the corner of the screen. Imagine leaving the dungeon and being unable to progress. I suppose you could argue that it teaches you that chests are important, that you should always look out for them, and admittedly you might be right. Something I noticed about this scene is that the game waits for you to jump over this gap before your partner leaves you. That's sneakily clever, because if he had left right after the boss fight, they would have had to animate him jumping onto the turtle shells. I see your tricks, game. What doesn't make sense though? Why doesn't he stay with you until you leave? I mean, you're both going in the same direction, you're both leaving the dungeon. He couldn't walk with you for another couple minutes? From a gameplay perspective, I get that it's supposed to highlight how you've become stronger. You don't have anybody dragging you around anymore. Being by yourself, especially to a kid, is somewhat of an emotional fantasy. It represents the freedom that they can't have. What's the matter, Tristan? You don't like me? You couldn't hang out with me for another minute? Does Kaylee like me? Does Phoebe like me? Does anybody like me? I mean, they are all stronger than me. Maybe one of them should be the hero instead of me. Although this idea is, like a lot of other things, undercut in a way. Because when you kill an enemy, they stay dead as long as you're still in the area, meaning that the path back to the entrance was already cleared before your partner leaves you. So you don't actually get a chance to show off your improved strength unless you go out of your way to do so. I've established that it doesn't quite work as an introductory, but what about me? What about us? What can Final Fantasy Mystic Quest offer someone who isn't a 5-year-old grandma? It's the kind of game where most of the time winning just requires you to press A, which is in a way, in this case, an acceptable trait, because the game is so bland that it's tough to give it your full attention. The way to get through this game is with a controller in one hand and a book in the other. This might make a good phone game, because it can be a short burst of bullcrap as you wait for the county plumbing inspector, or whatever you do to have free moments throughout the day. They were nice enough to label which treasure chests have important items, so you know which ones to skip. You're not going to want to fight every enemy, because most of them are a waste of time. Take this room. I walked in, saw a crowd of enemies guarding a chest with some consumables, and walked the hell out. Speaking of nice features, why the heck aren't you able to jump in more of these? Not only is it a simple, more fun way to move around, but it solves completely the NPC shuffle. In the past are the days where someone would trap you or block a narrow path. This could have been genre changing, but unfortunately, most of the ideas in this game, good or bad, ended here. Instead of having monster encounters on the world select, they included these battlegrounds where you can grind for experience. There's 10 battles per battlefield and 20 battlefields in the game. If you defeat all 10 in an area, you get a little bonus. Sometimes it's gold or EXP, but other times it'll be an item or spell. Even with the rewards, they don't matter. I cleared some of them out for fun, I guess, but you can do as many or as few as you want. They're the closest thing this game has to side quests, and they rapidly devolve into pressing A for a few minutes until it's over. If you're anything like me, you're probably not even looking at the screen during these. People might look at these areas as innocuous, because you're not required to do them, but I see them as a missed opportunity. They should have been a short little side area, a proper one where you walk around like in a town or dungeon, with a few monsters and a chest at the end containing whatever the reward is. Not that the real areas are anything special, because they're not. They're unremarkable and lacking in creativity. It's got the grassland, iceland, fireland, dirtland thing going on. There's this thing called the Rainbow Road, which Sid makes. Haha, just kidding. He's not actually named Sid, but he definitely should have been. You can't actually go to the Rainbow Road. It's just something that you walk over on the world map. I guess a road made of rainbows was too good of an idea to put the effort into making it explorable. I'll admit there was one part where I looked up a walkthrough. This barrel being guarded by a monster, and only this barrel in an area full of them can be pushed out of the way. After consulting the guide, about 90% of the way through the game might I add, I decided to look up maps for the final area, not because I needed them, just because I wanted to be done. There was no desire to devote any of my treasured brain cells to mentally mapping this game out. After defeating the final boss and outlining the script I just read to you, I saw something interesting online. The life spell, which can normally be used to revive your ally or restore your health to full, making the regular cure spell kind of redundant actually, is apparently bugged to kill most random enemies in one shot. This intrigued me so much that I went back into my save and decided to test it out. It worked on the enemies in the final area, so now I'm curious. How many enemies can you cheese this way? I went back to every area, hunting down every enemy type to get a statistic. It worked on 82%. Since I already killed the bosses, I don't know if it works on any of them, and from what I read it shouldn't, but I can't confirm this for myself. It's actually pretty funny. I used to think that Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was the first one because I didn't know about the NES game, and I'm too young to have experienced these games as they came out, you know? Actually, if YouTube analytics are anything to go by, there's a good chance that you watching are older than I am, which has to be a first for YouTube. I have to be at least one of the very few people on YouTube who can say that their audience is older than they are. Anyway, where was I? So all I saw was a Final Fantasy with a 2, a Final Fantasy with a 3, and a Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. So I just assumed that Mystic Quest came first. It doesn't do a very good job of teaching new players, and it doesn't really have a lot to offer for returning players. So Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is a game whose audience I don't know exists, if that makes any sense. I'm pretty sure it didn't review very well at the time, and Square seemed to learn their lesson because they gave us Final Fantasy III when it was time for that to come out. No questions asked. So I guess all's well that ends well.